Welcome, I'm Tom Saffold, your host for George Washington Speaks. The delay between the passage of the Stamp Act on March 3, 1764, and its taking effect 6 months later, allowing the colonies to meet together in October of 1765 and respond in a united way to Parliament. However, although the colonies were seeking to arrive at a common response, they found they were far from being united on every issue and even differed to the point that one member challenged another member to a duel. That and other issues are part of our history in the Stamp Act Congress edition of George Washington Speaks.
Although the Stamp Act was passed by Parliament on March 22, 1765, it was not scheduled to take effect in the colonies until November 1, 1765, 7 months later. The news arrived in the colonies in May, and that gave them adequate opportunity to respond before the tea arrived, and as usual, they responded in many different ways. Boston, as we have noted, was quick to react by forming the Sons of Liberty and intimidating local stamp distributor Andrew Oliver by marching to his house and vandalizing it. The Sons of Liberty also formed local committees of correspondence, which communicated with the other colonies and formed a loose coalition with them. As a result, colonial stamp distributors in other cities were also intimidated by other groups of Sons of Liberty, and most of them resigned their commission, and as a result, the tax was never effectively collected. At the same time, merchants in the larger port cities were enacting colonial boycotts of English manufactured goods to protest the Stamp Act tax. They formed a loose non-importation agreement between themselves. For the most part, the merchants in the cities, especially in Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and Charleston, agreed not to sell British products, and at the same time, the residents of those cities agreed not to buy them from other merchants. In June 1765, a month after hearing about the passage of the Stamp Act, the Massachusetts Assembly drafted a letter, which was sent to the legislatures of the several colonies of this continent to consult together on the present circumstances of the colonies, that is, to get together in a meeting. When word of this action reached London, it caused great alarm in Britain. Why? Because the representatives to this Congress would not be from the government-sanctioned provincial legislatures. Instead, they would be appointed by, the common colonists themselves. Oh my gosh, their own elected representatives? The Lords of Trade, who advised the king and his privy council about import and export matters, were so disturbed about the meeting of these unsanctioned colonial representatives that they wrote to the king. This is a matter of the utmost importance to the kingdom and legislature of Great Britain. They did not know, but they assumed that the issues they will be discussing are proper only for the consideration of Parliament itself. They went on to say, this appears to us to be the first instance of any general Congress appointed by the assemblies of the colonies, without the authority of the Crown, a measure which we conceive to be a dangerous tendency in itself. And it was no doubt responded to by other members of the Parliament with, quite right, and hear, hear. However, as it turned out, the more urgent and pressing issue for Parliament was not the response of the English colonists, but the economic protests that came from the British merchants. It turns out that the merchants were more concerned that their business and profits would suffer from the non-importation agreements enacted by the colonial port merchants than they were as a consequence of the Stamp Act Congress. It took the colonies 5 months to organize and meet, since it was no easy thing for each colony to do. They had to elect delegates. They had to convince them to travel 100 to 1,000 miles over poor dirt roads, and to leave their businesses or their farms for up to a month. And then many of them had to pay for all of their own costs to travel, eat, and lodge. The meeting would be the first time that the elected representatives of the colonies would gather together out of their own initiative, and that was due to the ongoing encroachments of the mother country. Representatives from 9 of the 13 colonies met at Federal Hall in New York from October 7th through the 25th, 1765. The 9 colonies came together in an effort to agree on how best they should respond as a unified group to the new British Tax Act. The early debates center on 2 issues. The first issue was the difference between an indirect or an external tax, which is a fee or a duty on a product that's imported from England for the express purpose of administering and processing the item, which the colonies, quite frankly, were used to, and a direct or an internal tax that was applied directly to an asset currently owned by an individual, such as land or possessions or an item that the individual was going to own through a purchase. The second issue was to find formal and consistent justification of their conviction that only the colonial assemblies had the right to levy a direct or an internal tax. There were several heated debates and personal clashes between the representatives of that meeting. One of the more fiery exchanges involved the chairman of Congress, Timothy Ruggles from Massachusetts, who was tasked to keep order, and Thomas McKean from Delaware. They had an angry exchange when Ruggles was forcibly challenged by McKean, and then Ruggles openly admitted that from the first he had been opposed to the conclusions of the document that they had forged together. When McLean asked why Ruggles accepted the appointment of the chairmanship of the Congress when he already knew he could not be impartial to all concerned, Ruggles became enraged and challenged McKean to a duel. The duel, however, did not take place, but Ruggles left New York early the next morning. The Congress ended up issuing a Declaration of Rights and Grievances. The members spent much time drafting the statement, since it was their desire to balance their colonial rights to be heard with the royal authority and the powers of Parliament to legislate. The Declaration included these points: that we were loyal to the Crown, that according to the rights of Englishmen and the more general freedom of the people, only representatives chosen by the colonists could levy taxes, and that because Parliament did not include any representation from the colonies, Parliament did not have the right to impose the tax. Now, members of 6 of the 9 delegations sent to the meeting signed petitions objecting to the Stamp Act's provisions. They then sent the declaration to Parliament and King George III. How did Parliament respond? Well, both the House of Lords and the House of Commons rejected the petition. Why? Well, because the House of Lords felt that it was an inappropriate document. The House of Commons dismissed it, since it had been submitted by an unconstitutional assembly. So neither house paid any attention to the colonial rights and grievances, although, as Englishmen, the colonists had worked very hard to draft and submit their concerns in hopes of being heard and reaching a resolution with the mother country. Again, practically speaking, the economic issues became more important factors, and the British Parliament ended up repealing the Stamp Act 5 months later, and not to the voice of the English colonists. It is interesting to note that in the end, the collection of the tax was a total failure. More than 100,000 pounds worth of stamps were shipped to America. Why, That's as much as the weight of 10 adult elephants. With the tax collectors resigning due to the influence of the Sons of Liberty, few people distributed the stamps or collected the tax. Thus, the act was never effectively implemented. Parliament intended that the tax would raise £60,000 per year, which was some 20% of the total amount to maintain the troops in the colonies. Now, Georgia was the only colony to collect the tax, and they only collected £45. That's right, £45. The joy of the Stamp Act being repealed was short-lived when we realized that there was another act passed at the same time, which had a much greater impact on our relationship to England. It was the Declaratory Act, which applied to Parliament, making laws binding on the American colonies in all cases whatsoever. And what is meant by all cases whatsoever? Why, that's the topic for the next edition of George Washington Speaks.
Since the colonists had established an effective means of communication through the committees of correspondence, several of the colonies had united in addressing Parliament with their grievances. But the results were not what they'd hoped for, and Parliament soon gave them more to complain about. In the next edition of George Washington Speaks, we discuss the implication of the Declaratory Act and other laws that further inflamed the colonies.